Welcome, everybody, to our Siyum Masechet Yevamot. We're so excited to have you all here. We have a great program planned, and we're very proud of all of those of you who have finished, those of you who haven't necessarily finished. I know it was not an easy Masechet to finish, so if you haven't finished, it's okay. You can always go back to it. You can always finish it on your own time. We're just excited I'll tell you what the program is going to include. We're going to have finishing the daf as usual, finishing the last part of the last daf. We'll do the hadrons together. Then we're very excited to have Dean Rachel Friedman, who's going to provide us with a kind of more philosophical perspective from a biblical perspective of the mitzvah of Yibum and Chalitza, which we've been learning for a long time. And after that, we're going to get to the more practical. I tried to combine here tonight. Our program is to combine both the conceptual framework and the practical. We're going to hear from my husband, Rabbi Seth Barber. We'll get to that later. And after that, we're going to have a community speaker who's actually getting married, and learning Yevamot with the background of an upcoming wedding is also very interesting. So all those ideas combined will give us our full siyum. Okay, our Siyum sponsors for tonight. We have a bunch of sponsors. Siyum Yevamot is sponsored by Minna and Cliff Felig in loving memory of Rav David Weiss Halivni, who passed away last week. We have the honor of learning Rav Halivni's Torah through the shirim led by his son Baruch, to whom we wish a long life. The Siyum is also sponsored by Alana Bernstein Storch, with gratitude and appreciation to Rabbanit Farber, the many scholars in Chavrutot that carried us through this challenging and difficult Masechet, enabling us to find the pearls among the shards of Yevamot. And Siyum Yevamot is also sponsored by the Schuster family on behalf of Sharona Schuster. Schuster family of Edison wishes her a mazal tov on finishing her first Masechet of Talmud. Not an easy one to be your first. She's doing so in memory of her mother, Sandra Shimoff, who was a great learner in her own right, finishing the Talmud, you ready for this one? 3 times. Sharona would like to thank Rabbanit Michelle for being a great Magidat Shiur, and her husband, and Sharona's husband, so not to get confused, to encourage Sharona to learn Talmud. He started a wonderful early morning routine. She hopes with Hashem's help to continue learning with the Hadron community. Okay, it's great to be here. It's great to see you all here, and we're going to get started. So we're going to learn starting from the bottom of Kuf Chaf Bet Amud Aleph at the Mishnah. So just to review for a quick minute, because also those of you who did this already who are working on time, it's already been a few days. We were in a Mishnah. The previous Mishnah had talked about the history, which was very interesting. We talked about it was a little atypical of a Mishnah to give a historical recounting of how they decided to accept one witness, and not only one witness, to be believed in order to testify to a man having died and allow the woman to remarry. But also, we talked about not only that, but also a woman who generally isn't accepted, a woman herself about her own husband, which is also really interesting. In fact, if you remember, that was the earliest addition. The earliest change was to have Redi Beit Shammai had said women should be allowed to testify for their own husbands based on a story that he had seen, a case that had happened. It made him realize that many times people die, nobody sees, and we have to be willing to accept this kind of testimony. Then we had the next development was, well, we can accept one witness. And then there was a debate. Well, is one witness only one kosher witness? Could it be also a woman? Could it be a slave? Could it be other kind of a relative? To which we ended the previous Mishnah by saying, well, in fact, at an earlier time, Rabbi Akiva had said one witness, yes, but not a non-kosher witness, not a witness who generally is not accepted in general with, normally you need 2 witnesses. He said, not those kind of witnesses, only a kosher witness. To which the Mishnah says, Amrulo, Maaseh b'bnei Levi. So now they want to bring a proof from a story. Say there was a case that happened, and that disproves your point. It's always very strong when we can disprove something from a case that happened. So they said to him, there was a case b'bnei Levi on 5 lines from the bottom of Kuf Chaf Bet. Shalchu litzoach ir hatzmarim, v'chala echad mehem b'vi'u b'pundak. One of them got sick, and they brought him into an inn. Ubechazaratam amru lapundakit. They went to the innkeeper, the female innkeeper, and they said to her, Ayeh chavereinu. They left their friend sick. They come back. They say, where is he? Numit lahem. She said to them, Meit ukvaltiv. He died, and I buried him. V'isiu et ishto. Comes Rabbi Akiva, comes the rabbis to Rabbi Akiva, and they said, to Rabbi Akiva. I don't understand. Why won't you allow a woman's testimony? Here, they based it on this innkeeper's testimony, and they allowed this woman to marry based on her testimony. Velote kohenet kepundakit, and is not a kohenet like a pundakit. This is a very strong line. What it's basically saying is, if we have a woman who comes from a family of kohanim, forget about, also even a regular Jewish woman, but the point being is someone who's from a family of kohanim. We had a lot of discussions about lineage and all the importance of the lineage. Someone who comes from the best of us, what is she not as good as a pundakit, an innkeeper? Innkeepers were not exactly thought of as the most pure people. So Amar Lahu, he says to the rabbis, that's not a proof at all. And he says a very strong line. There's actually some different versions of it. I'll go with one version. If the Kohenet woman that you're referring to, who's just a theoretical Kohenet woman, or any Jewish woman, is as convincing as this pundakit, I will accept them. To which he says, what was so special about this pundakit? Well, a pundakit utzia lehem maklo v'tarmilo v'sefer Torah shebiyado. She had evidence. She had his stuff. She had his staff. She had his bag, his satchel, and she had his Sefer Torah. Interesting to think that people carried around a Sefer Torah with them when they traveled. She pulled out all that stuff, and there you have it. To which the Gemara starts off and says, okay, so what Rabbi Akiva is basically saying is, if there was clear evidence here, it wasn't that we were relying on one woman's testimony. It was her testimony combined with evidence. If you provide me with evidence like that, then I'll believe a woman also. But without evidence and just her word, that's not good enough. It's very interesting that we're ending the Masechah with issues about accepting a woman's word, because that's going to be one of the Mishnayot in the first chapter of Ketubot is all about when we have the woman's word against the husband's word, were there betulim, were there not betulim, was she a virgin when she got married or was she not? There's going to be a whole discussion. How do we know who to believe? So very often, if you recall, we've seen this many times. The end of Masechtot somewhat mirror the beginning of the next Masech. The Gemara now wants to know what was so bad about this pundakit woman, this innkeeper. Why does she have such a bad rap in this Mishnah? What was so bad? Amar Rav Kahana pundakit ovedet kochavim aita. She was a Gentile. She was not Jewish. That was the issue here. And that's why they were saying, what? A Kohenet, you're going to believe this Gentile woman over a Kohenet? Remember, we had a whole sugya about whether Gentiles could be believed, to which we said they could either be believed if they're testifying but not to marry someone off, or the main opinion was really Misicha Lefi Tuma, if she is saying it in the course of conversation, to which the Gemara says, number one, Rav Kahana explains she was an Ovedet Kochavim. The question is, though, why do we believe her? So we said, well, the reason we believed her was number one, Misicha Lefi Tuma. She was just talking about it in the context of a conversation. She wasn't trying to testify in court. When it comes to testifying in court, we're worried that they might try to mess us up somehow. But she was just talking in a conversation. And all the more so, as we talked about in the Mishnah, Zemaklo, Vizet Tarmilo, Vizet Kever Shekvartivbo. By the way, in this clearly has a bit of a different version than our Mishnah. There's no Sefer Torah in this one. This is his makel she pulled out, his staff. She pulled out his satchel, and she pointed to his grave and said, this is where he's buried. So there's a bit of different versions here going on. And V'chein Tani Abba Boei de Raman Yume Barchia, also he brought a braita. Pundakit Ovedet Kochavim Aita, she was a Gentile. Umisicha Lefi Tuma Aita, and she spoke in the context of a conversation. I've talked about this in the sugya of the Avodah of Dei Chochavim, but in case there's people here who weren't at the previous class and didn't hear, obviously when we have these sugyot about Gentiles where they give them a bad rap, you have to remember again the social context and what was going on, and that there were Gentiles again. Just like there's women in our Masechet who they were suspicious of, and there's men in our Masechet who they were suspicious of, and there's Gentiles in the Masechet who they're suspicious of. The system, first of all, we talked about number one, it's a matter of also sometimes there were Gentiles in those days that were really the enemies of the Jews and were doing things to mess them up. Number two, the system has to worry about the percentage of people that might be like that, even if 80% of the people or 90% of the people don't lie. But because of the 10% that lie or the 20% that lie, the system has to be understanding of that. So we have to understand these things in that context, and not that all women aren't believed, and all mothers-in-laws dislike their daughter-in-laws. And obviously, we know that that's not the case, and it's not always the situation. But the law has to be concerned that maybe this might be the small percentage of people where that does happen, and therefore possibly compensate for it. So in any case, we now say, we have this Braita where it says, again, the same thing as, this is really just a support for Rav Kahana, because Rav Kahana is an Amora, and if you have a Braita that can support it, that's always good. A Braita is from the previous time period and the time period of the Mishnah. And now the Gemara asked, but wait a minute. Okay, so here also it said she was an Ovedet Kochavi. She was Misicha Lefi Tumah. It was just in the context of a conversation she said it. She wasn't trying to testify. And she had his makel, his tarmil, and the grave that he was buried in. But now the Gemara asks, what do you mean this was Misicha Lefi Tumah? Misicha Lefi Tumah means I'm having a conversation with you about something, and it happens to come up that somebody died. That's Misicha Lefi Tumah. Or we had the stories where the person's walking on the street saying, where is this so-and where's the family of so-and-so because he died? That's Mesicha Lefi Tumah. But Amrula ayeh chaverenu. V'ha ayeh chaverenu ka'amrela. They said to her, where is our friend? So she wasn't exactly testifying in court, but she was put on the spot to say, where is he? And she answered. That's not Mesicha Lefi Tumah. Mesicha Lefi Tumah is where it just happens to come up somehow in conversation. That's not exactly what happened here. So how can you say that's the situation? To which they said, oh, wait, there was more to the story. They saw her crying when they got back. They left their friend very sick. They went off, they come back, and they see the woman crying, which was an indicator that something bad had happened. Amrule, ayeh chaverenu, and then they said to her, ayeh chaverenu, where is our friend? Understanding that something was wrong. And Amra lahen meit ukfartiv, and that's why it was Mesicha Lefi Tumah. What you see here is, and we're going to get back to this at the very end today, which is there's this idea here of looking into a particular situation, looking at all the details, trying to assess, can we believe this woman or not? So they took a number of factors into consideration. On the one hand, she was an innkeeper. Innkeepers were known possibly to even maybe sleep around with people, not be the most trustworthy. Number two, she was a Gentile. Gentiles also possible reason to distrust. On the other hand, she had evidence and she wasn't going to court with it, right? She was basically just put on the spot and responded again in a context where she was already crying. And that altogether made the rabbis believe that they could marry off this woman and assume her husband was dead. Tanu Rabbanan. We're now going to bring a Braita and we're going to have two versions of Rabbi Tarfon. Question now becomes how severe or how seriously do we need to question the witnesses when they come to court, when they want to testify about someone dying? When we get to Sanhedrin, we're going to learn that there was a whole process of Drishan Chakira. You have to quiz them to make sure. You have to kind of try to trip them up and make sure they still stick with the same answer. Do you need to do that here as well? In other words, again, do we suspend all normal rules of witness testimony, like kosher witnesses, relatives, even the woman herself can testify? So does that mean we also suspend Drishan Chakira or not necessarily? So let's see what the Braita has to say. There was a person who came to testify about a woman before Rabbi Tarfon. How do you know? I'll tell you a long story, right? This is a good example, right? I got a story to tell you. So the story starts way before the person died. We were in a path. There was an army chasing us. He grabbed onto a branch of an olive tree, saved himself, and with that he pushed back the army. Okay, he fought them basically, on his own. Amartilo aryeh asher kochacha. I said, "Wow, you're a lion! What a strong lion you are!" Yashakach. Amar li minayin ata yodeh she'aryeh shmi. How did you know my name was Aryeh? I didn't tell you my name. Kach korin oti be'iri. He said, in fact, that's what people call me. They call me Yochanan beRabbi Yonatan Aryeh de Mikfar Shichya. Yochanan, the son of Rabbi Yonatan, the lion from Kfar Shichya. Liyamin chalav v'met. Soon after that, the guy got sick and he died. But you see, Rabbi Tarfon at this show came this person testify about him. How did he know his name? From this story that the guy told him. He knew who he was, and therefore he then testified about him. And Rabbi Tarfon said, great, no problem. You know his name. He told you his name. It must be that's the guy who died. And she's good to go. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Rabbi Tarfon Labai Drisha B'Chakira? He doesn't require any sort of questioning? V'hatanya, wait a minute. We have a Braita that says the exact opposite. And not only does it say the opposite, it's the exact same story with one major difference. So this Braita says, again, the person came to testify about a woman that her husband had died. How do you know who this person was? We were on the path, they were chasing us. Here it's a little different. Instead of a zayid, it's a te'ina, it's a fig tree. He single-handedly fought against them. And to which he said, wow, you knew, how did you figure out my name? Or Yafesha Kivanta, instead of how did you, he didn't ask the question. This time he said, oh, wow, how amazing it is that you figured out what my name is. Shekach Kolino Tibi'iri, because this is what they call me, Yochanan ben Yonatan, Aryeh to be Kfar Shichya, Liyamim Chalav Meit, same story. Amarlo, now, when Rabbi Tarfon hears this from him, he says to him, Lo kach amarta li Yochanan ben Yonatan de Mikfar Shichya Aryeh. Did you not tell me his name was Yochanan, the son of Yonatan, from Kfar Shichya, the lion? Amar le lo. He said, no, that's not what I said. You see, he's trying to trip him up. Ela kach amarti lecha. Yochanan, and then he corrects himself and he says, Yochanan ben Yonatan Aryeh de Mikfar Shichya. V'diktek alav shnayim shlosha pamim. Rabbi Tarfon went through this 2-3 times, kept trying to trip him up. V'kiven et varav. Every time he said the exact same thing. V'yisi Rabbi Tarfon et isho. So now you see, there's some confusion here. Does Rabbi Tarfon say you need Risha Chakira or you don't need it? To which the Gemara says, Tanahi, it's Machloket Tanaim, and apparently each Braita follows a different version. It's a little tricky here. Usually Machloket Tanaim, we'd say one is Rabbi Tarfon, one is somebody else. Here they're both Rabbi Tarfon, but it's obviously different versions of what Rabbi Tarfon actually said. To which they say, right, here, one opinion, the one that says you don't need Rishon Chakira, appears as Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Tarfon Omer Bodkin. Rabbi Tarfon says you need it. A different version, by the way, is Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva together on one side against the rabbis on the other side. There's a whole bunch of different versions who said what. The main point is there's a debate about it. What's the root of this debate? And it's a fascinating way to end our Masechet. To Amar Rabbi Chanina, Dvar Torah, Echad Dinei Mamonot, Echad Dinei Nefashot, B'Drisha B'Chakira. The Torah, by Torah law, Mamonot, monetary law, and nefashot, anything that has to do with capital punishment, all needs Rishon Chakira. How do we know this? Shene'emar mishpat echad yeh lachem. There's one law for all of you. That means Rishon Chakira apply across the board. Umatam amru dinei mamonot ein tzrichim drisha b'chakira. We seem to be a little bit off topic here. I'm not talking at all about our case. Why does dinei mamonot, financial issues, why do you not need Rishon Chakira? The rabbi said, if we make Rishon Chakira, nobody's going to loan money to people, because every time they go to loan money to people, what's going to happen? They're going to get to court and they're going to question them. And if they answer the wrong question, they're going to throw you out of court. You won't be able to collect on your loan. Same reason why they instituted Pruzbal, so that we won't close the door to people loaning money. So that's why Dinei Mamonot doesn't need Rishon Chakira, but Dinei Nefashot does. To which, and it's all rabbinic here, right? By Torah law, it all needs it. So now, what's the root of the debate? The whole issue here, if he dies, she gets to get her ketubah money. So it's a financial issue. What do you mean? If you permit her, the other one says, she really maybe is a married woman, because maybe her husband didn't die. And what will happen? She'll be a married woman married to somebody else. She'll be liable to the death penalty. It's capital punishment. Where do we put this? We've seen this before throughout the Masechet. There's always this, we don't know, where does this fall? Is it Dinei Mamonot? Is it Dinei Nefashot? Right? Is it Arayot, or is it more the financial issue? And, it's same, right? Some people marry for money. Some people marry for love, right? It's not really what's going on here, but there's different elements pulling at it. And which the Gemara ends with, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Chanina, the same way that Brachot ends, Masechet Kritut ends, and Masechet Nazir ends. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Tamidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam, Shene'emar B'chol Banayich Limudei Hashem B'rav Shalom Banayich. Okay, Talmidei Chachamim bring peace to the world. As it says, all your sons, Limudei Hashem, B'Rav Shalom Banayach. The continuation, as we know from davening, is Al Tikrei Banayach Ela Bonayach. They're the ones who build. Anyway, they're the peacemakers. With that, Hadran Alachi Shabatra Uslicha La Masechet Yevamot. And with that, we finish our Masechet. What an interesting end. So what's going on here? I'll speak very briefly today about this, but what I wanted to talk about, this page highlights a lot of interesting things, an interesting way to end our Masechet. We end with a very big question. After learning 121 pages of Yevamot, you'd think that we'd have the answer to this question. Is it Dinei Mamonot? Is it Dinei Nefashot? Where does it fall? But we don't. Why don't we? Because as much as we are always seeking truth, the truth is not absolute, number one. And in the end, what does the Masechet end with? It's about shalom. It's not about truth, right? This truth is important. And in our learning, we're always right. You would think, Talmidei Chachamim, they're all about truth, seeking who's right, what's the right answer, what did God really intend? But in the end, it's really shalom that's more important. And I think the first point that the Gemara is making here is that we don't really know everything. We can't find all the answers. Okay, I was thinking it connected for me that all those studiot about disabilities and the cheresh and nitcharesh, all those different kinds, and how we're all limited. We all have some disabilities, some things that we're not fully capable of doing. And one of them is understanding everything. I know some people felt about this Masechet that they didn't understand most of what went on in the Masechet. And I know it was a confusing Masechet. But in the end, right, we have on the one hand, this idea of not understanding that we won't understand everything. On the other hand, when you don't understand things and you're disabled in a particular way or unable to do everything, that might paralyze you and say, well, then I'm not going to do anything. And what this Masechet is ending with is this idea that the rabbis, as opposed to saying, well, we don't have two witnesses and the Torah law is two witnesses and sorry, but this woman can't get married. No, they find a way. Even the most unlikely candidate, this puntakit, they look into it and they check and they look into each situation and they personalize it and they get into figuring out how can we resolve the situation. So on the one hand, we don't know everything. We don't really know, is this person dead? We don't really know what Yevamot is all about. Is it Mamonot? Is it Nefashot, right? In this case, they're not really talking about Yibum, but they're talking about the general issue. If someone's alive, not. Anyway, the idea here being is that we have these things pulling at us at all times. On the one hand, wanting to know everything and realizing that we can't, and yet not letting that paralyze us, but moving on to try to resolve situations. So with that, we will finish. And that leaves a lot of thoughts in our minds of where we can take that, everyone in their own personal way. Before we do the Hadrons, I just want to give a very special thank you to a bunch of people that really deserve thanks for this Masechet, for helping us all really pull through. And I had this idea of making the Yevamot presentations, and I knew I couldn't do it by myself. And I pulled together a team of really amazing people. I'll call them out by name: Karen Rosenberg, Rachel Stern-Monitz, Chamutal Erlich, Yael Nitzanim. Yael gets the credit for translating everything into English. Mimi and Maggie, who really worked hard to make it all happen. From the design team, we have the content team, the translation team, the design team. With that, they really helped us through this Masechet, including myself. I remember last time I taught, I get tripped up on who is what, and having the presentations really helped me as well, besides helping everybody else. So thank you for all that hard work. And I will now pull up the Hadrons and we will say them together. Okay, sorry, 1 second. Things open here. Okay, here we go. Everybody ready? Hadran alach Masechet Yevamot v'hadra chalan. Da'atan alach Masechet Yevamot v'da'ata chalan. Lo nitneshe minach Masechet Yevamot v'lo titneshe minan. Lo ba'al mahaden v'lo ba'al mada'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Yevamot v'hadra chalan. Da'atan alach Masechet Yevamot v'da'ata chalan. Lo nitneshe minach Masechet Yevamot v'lo titneshe minan. Lo ba'al mahaden v'lo ba'al mada'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Yevamot v'hadra chalan. Da'atan alach Masechet Yevamot v'da'ata chalan. Lo nitneshe minach Masechet Yevamot v'lo titneshe minan. Lo ba'al mahaden v'lo ba'al mada'ate. Yihi ratzon l'fanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu שתהא תורתך אומנותנו בעולם הזה, תהימנו לעולם הבא. חנינה בר פאפה, רמי בר פאפה, נחמן בר פאפה, אחי בר פאפה, אבא בר פאפה, רחמן בר פאפה, רחיש בר פאפה, סורחה בר פאפה, עדה בר פאפה, דרו בר פאפה. הערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפיות עמך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו צאצאינו, נהיה אנחנו כולנו צאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. מאוהבי תחכמני מצוותיך כי לעולם היא לי. יהי ליבי תמים בחוקיך למען לא אבוש, לעולם לא אשכח פקודיך כי בם חייתני. ברוך אתה אדוני למדני חוקיך, אמן 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 סלע ועד. יהי רצון לפניך אדוני אלוהי, כשם שעזרתני לסיים מסכת יבמות, כן תעזרני להתחיל מסכתות וספרים אחרים ולסיימם, ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. וזכות כל התנאים ואמוראים ותלמידי חכמים יעמוד לנו ולזרענו, שלא תמוש התורה מפינו ומפי זרענו עד עולם. ויתקיים בנו בתהלכך תנחה אותך, בשוכבך תשמור עליך, בקיצותה היא תשיחך. כי ברי ירבו ימיך ויוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים בימינה, בשמאלה עושר וכבוד, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. אשר כוחכם to everybody here. Wow, what an accomplishment. Okay, I'm very, very excited to announce our next speaker. We have the pleasure of having Dean Rachel Friedman with us tonight. I heard about Dean Rachel many, many, many years ago. My mother-in-law, apropos mothers-in-law, my mother-in-law, Ala Shalom Esther Farber, ran a project that she initiated called Tanakh Yomi. Okay, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And her favorite contributor to Tanakh Yomi, she had all different contributors, but her absolute favorite was Dean Rachel. She used to talk about her all the time. And she really was always amazed by her talents. So I'm very excited that we get to have her here. Oh no, something just went out in my house. Excuse me. I don't know what that was. Okay. So Dean Rachel was, first of all, worked many, many years as the associate dean and the chair of Tanakh Atrisha, and then founded her own learning institution called Lamdenu in Teaneck. If you haven't heard about it, you should look it up. And I'm pretty sure they have a lot of shiurim on Zoom as well. And it's an adult learning institute. And with no further ado, we're going to hear right now from Dean Rachel.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, first of all, wow. Mazel tov, everyone. How beautiful. And I am just so honored and thrilled to be with you here today. My name is Dean Rachel Friedman, and I founded Lamdenu, an institute for advanced, accessible, and inspiring Jewish text study on Zoom worldwide and in person in Teaneck, New Jersey. It's really an honor for me to join Hadram Siyum today and to deliver these words of Torah and reflection. As a young woman, I studied and practiced American law. After the birth of my daughter, who's the second of my 3 children, I transitioned to my vocation and avocation as a teacher of Torah. I spent 17 years, as Michelle alluded to, as Rabbanit Michelle alluded to, at Drisha Institute in New York City, where I served as chair of Bible and associate dean. 8 years ago, I founded Lamdenu, and I have the joy of teaching and learning there every single day. You may visit us at lamdenu.org, and I look forward to seeing you. Thank you so much to Rabbanit Michelle for inviting me to participate in the Hadran Siyum and Masechet Yevamot, and thank you so much to Maggie Sandler and everyone who worked so hard to bring this wonderful event to fruition. My role this morning is to share some thoughts on the topic of Yibum and Chalitza from a biblical perspective. More specifically, I will focus on the experience of Yibum, or levirate marriage, for women as it's described in the Torah and in Nach, the books of the prophets and writings. As you know from your study of Masechet Yevamot, Yibum, or levirate marriage, refers to a union between a man and the childless widow of his deceased relative, arranged for the purpose of producing a child. English word lever comes from the Latin term that means brother-in-law. The Hebrew description of the act are forms of the root Yud Bet Mem. Yibum is the act of levirate marriage, and Yivama is the deceased widow. Through the process of Yibum, the child of a union between a man and his deceased brother's widow provides a posthumous heir for the deceased brother and preserves the inheritance of the deceased for the widow and her child. Yibum also assured men in society that their name and memory would continue even after death if they died without a child. There's evidence that Yibum was practiced both in ancient Israel and in other ancient cultures, such as the Hittite culture, the Middle Assyrian societies. Different cultures considered different male relatives as qualified miyabnim. In some, only a biological brother was qualified, but in others, any male relative within a larger kinship constellation was a possible miyabim. There are only two texts in the Torah itself that explicitly deal with the obligation of Yibum. They are the story of Judah and Tamar in Breshit Lamechet in Genesis 38, and then the legal discussion of Yibum and Chalitza in Dvarim 25, verses 5 through 10. First appearance of Yibum is in Breshit, chapter 38. The story of Yehuda and Tamar is number one in your source sheets. The source sheets, I believe, are in the chat. They're there for your reference. I'm not going to be going through them, but I will refer to them. In the story of Yehuda and Tamar, we're going to focus on verses 2 through 11. In these psukim, Yehuda marries a Canaanite woman and has 3 sons with her, Onan, and Shelah. The oldest son, who's married to a woman named Tamar, dies without children. Onan, the younger brother, accepts the responsibility of having relations with Tamar, but deliberately avoids impregnating her with a child. Onan dies as well, and upon his death, the Yibum responsibility therefore falls on Shelah, right? He is now the Yabim. You can see this in verse 8. He is the youngest brother, and the responsibility now falls on him. However, fearing that Tamar is somehow the cause of both of his sons' deaths, and Onan, Yehuda avoids having his youngest son, Shelah, have relations with Tamar. The source sheet should be in the chat, but don't worry if you can't pull it up right away, because I will tell you everything you need to know. Okay? All right. Now, it's clear from the Torah that a child of the union of Tamar and Shelah as miyabim would have been considered the child of the deceased brother, But things go awry as the story progresses. Tamar waits in vain for Yehuda to fulfill his promise to give her Shelah in Yibum, in levirate marriage. Therefore, as the text moves forward in Bereshit 38, verses 12 through 30, Tamar puts a veil on herself and places herself strategically in Yehuda's path. Thinking that she's a prostitute, Yehuda purchases her services and unknowingly impregnates his own daughter-in-law with twin sons. When he hears later that his daughter-in-law is pregnant, he presumes that she has committed adultery, and he declares that she be sentenced to death by burning. But when Yehuda is confronted with evidence that Tamar is actually carrying his own offspring, Yehuda declares that Tamar is more righteous than himself. And I want you to focus on this verse, which I'll read to you. Reshit Lamedchet Chafav, Vayaker Yehuda Vayomer Tzadka Mimeni, Ki al Kain Lo Tatiha L'Sheila Bini. Yehuda acknowledged and said, Tamar is more righteous than I, Tzadka Mimeni, because I did not give her to my son Shelah. Now, this complex story concludes with what seems to be a positive outcome from the biblical perspective. Tamar gives birth to twins, Peretz and Zerach. The book of Ruth later clarifies that Peretz, the son of Tamar and Yehuda, is the direct ancestor of David HaMelech, of King David. Tamar is thus the mother, and Yehuda is the father of the Israelite kingship or monarchy. In the biblical story then of Yehuda and Tamar, the institution of Yibum did its job, so to speak, served to correct a seeming injustice in society. Yibum guaranteed that the Yevamah, the surviving wife, Tamar, would be assured of livelihood and physical protection by her deceased husband's family. The Bible frequently speaks of the challenges of widowhood, and Yibum is a way in which a childless widow's place in society is reinstated so that she can receive the support that she needs. Finally, in this story, Yibum accomplished the more mystical goal of assuring that heirs, lineage, and memory would continue after his death, even though he had not produced an heir. So, the story of Yehuda and Tamar suggests that Yibum is a tool of what I would call tzedek, or justice, in ancient society. Yehuda's declaration, Tzadka Mimeni, is more than a statement of relative morality in his specific situation. Rather, it provides a larger perspective on how the human system of Yibum, of levirate marriage, restores the status quo of a just society, even when tragic events like the premature death of a husband interferes with the expected inheritance and security of a family. This is so even at the cost of the seeming violation of certain taboos. In this case, the relations between Yehuda, who is a father-in-law, with his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Now, moving on in the Torah, Sefer Devarim also describes the ceremony of Yibum, but in a different textual medium. As you're aware, Devarim chapter 25, Psukim 5 through 10, offers a detailed legal treatment of Yibum, of levirate marriage. I gave it to you in source number 2, and you can look at it as you wish. These psukim in Devarim reframe the practice of Yibum in the Torah in a number of respects. First, the obligation of levirate marriage falls on the deceased man's brother. There's no mention of a more expanded kinship constellation, such as a father-in-law, which was the case in the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Furthermore, it is Devarim that introduces the process of release from levirate marriage, and that, of course, is chalitza. The process of chalitza is initiated at the discretion of the intended miyabim, the deceased man's brother, but it's performed publicly by the widow and, shall we say, the Yibum refuser, through a ritual in which both declare that the man refuses to perform Yibum on his predeceased brother's wife. The widow removes the sandal of the refuser, spits in his face, and declares, and this is in Dvarim Perek Chafei 25:9, so shall it be done unto the man that does not build up his brother's house. And I have this very funny recollection. In 8th grade, I had to do a play about Yibum and Chalitza, believe it or not. And so we came up with a little play about it. And what I remember most distinctly is that after the sandal was taken off, we started spraying Lysol all over the room. And everyone thought it was very funny. So thank you, Rabbanit Michelle, for my second experience of really delving into Yibum and Chalitza. So back to Devarim Chafei. Finally, the refuser's family is dubbed thereafter Beit Chalutz Hana'el, or the house of the unsandaled one, because he refused to build up his brother's house. This pejorative nickname degrades his own house. Now, I believe that the institution of Chalitza and Sefer Devarim serves to reinforce the importance of Yibum as a protective ritual for widows, while acknowledging its pitfalls in real human experience. Sometimes the goal of tzedek must be balanced against the trauma of family discord. The purpose of Yibum is to repair the lines of continuity that result from a man's death without children, and to secure the status of the childless widow. It's evident, however, that Yibum can at times create tension because it imposes a too great personal or economic burden on the potential miyabein, or because it unites a couple who might not be suitable for each other. Chalitza, thus, is the exception that strengthens the rule by providing a technical way out when Yibum interferes with family harmony. The final possible example of Yibum and Chalitza in the Bible is not in the Torah, but rather in the book of Ketuvim in Megillat Ruth. Most ancient and modern interpreters, with Rashi and Ibn Ezra as notable exceptions, assume that the marriage between Ruth and Boaz is a levirate union, is Yibum. They believe that in Ruth 3:9, Gimel Tet, Ruth is basing her request of Boaz for redemption on the assumption that Boaz is a Boel. He's a redeemer who must redeem Ruth and Naomi's land through levirate marriage. Thus, Ruth stealthily approaches Boaz when he's asleep on the threshing floor, and they have the following exchange. And this is in Ruth 3:9. Vayomer miat, vatomer, anochi Ruth amatecha, varasta kinafecha alamatcha, ki goelata. He says, who are you? And she answers, I'm Ruth, your handmaid. Spread your garment over me because you are the redeeming kinsman. Further evidence that this is a Yibum or Yibum-like situation is drawn from chapter 4, verse 5 of Megillat Ruth, where Boaz declares that the acquisition of Ruth by Peloni Almoni, the relative with the first right of refusal for levirate marriage of Ruth, and for acquisition of her husband's family property, would serve to, and I'm quoting the words, lehakim shem hamet al nachlato, to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate. Now, the Hebrew phrase lehakim shem, to establish the name of the deceased husband, appears in identical language in the legal passage describing Yibum in Devarim chapter 25, verse 7. Furthermore, in chapter 4 of Megillat Ruth, Boaz strategically describes two aspects of the Boel's duties, of the Redeemer's duty. It's both the redemption of land, but not only that, it's also Yibum, it's also levirate marriage to Ruth. Boaz emphasizes this double duty, if you will, to induce Peloni, the potential Boel, to cede his redemption rights and responsibilities to Boaz. Indeed, Boaz is successful. Peloni is concerned that taking Ruth as a wife would interfere with his existing nachala and perhaps also his current family equilibrium. Finally, the narrative in Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, which I encourage you to look over on your own, clearly and definitively evoke the description of Yibum and Chalitza as these rituals are described in Sefer Devarim, Perek Chafei, verses 5 through 10. A striking proof is the allusion in Ruth 4:12 to the biblical personalities of Yehudah, Tamar, and Peretz. Vihi beitcha kavei Peretz asher yalda Tamar lihudah min hazera asher yitain Hashem lecha min hanara hazot. The townspeople, right? The townspeople bless the marriage of Ruth and Boaz and say, Let your house be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore unto Yehudah, of the seed which the Lord shall give you of this young woman. This verse reinforces the argument that following the Chalitza ceremony with Poloni, Almoni, Ruth and Boaz indeed had a yibum, a levirate marriage. So where does all this leave us? I would suggest that the very fact that a version of yibum and Chalitza is the medium that moves the plot of the story of Ruth and Boaz to its positive conclusion speaks volumes about the symbolic significance of these rituals in biblical times. In the book of Ruth, Chalitza and Yibum are the vehicles for correcting a societal injustice and restoring the desired status quo. There's much to be said about how the story of Ruth is a literary redress or tikkun of the earlier story of Yehudah and Tamar. But I will mention two examples as they're most relevant to our Siyum discussion this evening. First, by arranging to be married to Boaz, rather than simply having relations with him, Ruth, with the guidance of Naomi and the consent of Poloni and the support of Boaz, is able to create a legal and public redemption of her deceased husband's name and property. And by doing so, she enables Boaz to cleanse the line of the tribe of Yehudah from the more questionable conduct of Yehudah in his interactions with Tamar in Bereshit 38. And second, by treating Ruth with respect and dignity in the private and public spheres through yibum and redemption of the land of her dead husband, Boaz actually and symbolically reverses the pattern of subjugation of women in the era of the Shoftim. I want to make this point very sharply. The book of Ruth opens with the words Vayehi bimei shofot hashoftim, and it came to pass in the days when the Shoftim ruled. And this calls attention at the very onset to the historical context of the story of Ruth, the era of the judges. The era of the Shoftim or judges in ancient Israel was in many ways a time of anarchy and social disorder. Most notably, it was a time when women were subject to the unchecked power of the patriarchy. And two striking examples from this book, from the book of Shoftim, are first, the sacrifice of the daughter of the Judge General Yiftach, resulting from his careless vow before going out to war. And I just mentioned the pshat. And second, the rape and mutilation of the concubine, the Pilegesh, of a man from the tribe of Levi while traveling in the territory of Binyamin in the story of Pilegesh B'Givah, the concubine from Givah. I believe that in Megillat Ruth, Boaz, who himself is from Beit Lechem Yehudah, symbolically purges the violation of the Pilegesh, who is similarly from Beit Lechem Yehudah, in the troubling story that is recounted in the closing chapters of Sefer Shoftim. The language similarities between the two stories, Pilegesh B'Givah and Megillat Ruth, are striking, while the contrasting outcomes are jarring. In the story of Pilegesh B'Givah, the solution to the tragedy of an oppressed Israelite woman, in this case, her horrific rape and mutilation, is the drawing of swords. The language is sholech cherev, in a civil war between the tribes of Am Yisrael. This is verses 15 and 17 of chapter 20 of Sefer Shoftim. It's in your source 4. Vayitpakdu b'nei Binyamin, bayom hahu me'harim 26,000 ish sholech cherev. There were 26,000 men that were sholech cherev, that drew swords. And this again is repeated 2 verses later. In the book of Ruth, however, Boaz deals with the tragedy of poor and widowed women, Ruth and Naomi, not with military force, but with due process in a public forum. This is the redemption process that is described in chapter 4 of Megillat Ruth. And I want you to look at the language because it blew me away when I saw this. Look specifically at chapter 4 of Megillat Ruth, verses 7 and 8. V'zot lefanim b'Yisrael al ha'geula v'al ha'timura lekayem kol davar shalaf ishna alo v'natan l're'ehu. This was the custom in ancient Israel concerning redemption. A man threw off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor. And this is what Ploni said to Boaz, and he drew off his shoe. Vayishlofna alo. The language similarity is unmistakable, and the message is even more powerful. In organizing and overseeing the ceremonies of Chalitza and Yibum in Ruth, chapter 4, verses 7 through 8, Boaz is Sholef Na'al rather than Sholef Cherev. By using this language parallel, Megillat Ruth suggests that in performing the ceremonies of Chalitza and Yibum, Ruth and Boaz are together negating the anarchy and repression of women in the era of the Shoftim. And the ultimate and highly positive consequence of their conduct from the biblical perspective is that Boaz and Ruth prepare the line of Yehudah for the advent of King David. In summary, read together and in light of each other, the laws of Yibum and Chalitza in Dvarim 25, and their practical enactments in the story of Yehudah and Tamar, and finally in the story of Ruth and Boaz, teach one of the most crucial messages of the Bible. Yibum and Chalitza are not simply vessels of an ancient system of common law. Rather, Yibum and Chalitza and Tanakh symbolize the role of the rule of law in organizing Israelite society and the superiority of the rule of law over military coercion and socio-political oppression. In the Bible, the possibility of human dignity and a kind and just society is expressed through the practice and symbolism of the ceremonies of Yibum and Chalitza. And perhaps this idea is hinted at in the very root of the word Chalitza, Chet Lamed Tzadi. This root is often related to the plunder of war, to a military procession, as in Chalutz. But in the Torah, Chet Lamed Tzadi is also the root of Chalitza, a mechanism of a peaceful, functioning society. The Bible teaches that communal ritual, in some cases creatively administered by individuals and institutions, paves the way for human beings to take care of those in their midst who are in need of support and sustenance. This is most evident in the story of Ruth. Boaz built support for his noble intentions by expanding the sanctioned tradition of the miyabeim, or redeeming relative. Ruth's courageous conduct and sterling reputation as a Neshet Chayil and caregiver for Naomi invigorate her cause in the eyes of the Beit Lechem community. The people of Beit Lechem, who are well aware of the irregular nature of the marriage of Ruth and Boaz, as is evident by their comparison of it to the union of Yehudah and Tamar, nonetheless publicly affirm the marriage. And finally, God places his imprimatur on the process and the result by granting Ruth her pregnancy in a unique biblical articulation in Ruth chapter 4, verse 13. Vayikach Boaz et Ruth atilo lisha vayavo eleha vayitein Hashem la herayon vateled ben. God gives Ruth conception, and this is a unique articulation, not just the climax of this book, but a unique articulation in the Bible. This, I believe, is also the intent of two beautiful and resonant midrashim in Ruth Rabbah, with which I will close. They are cited in your sources 6 and 7 of your source sheets. Amar Rabbi Ze'era Megillah zo ein ba lo tuma v'lo tara, lo isur v'lo heter, lama nichtiva. Lilamdecha kama sachar tov v'gomlei chasadim. Megillah doesn't talk about the nuances of purity or impurity. Why was it written? To teach you the reward that awaits those who do acts of kindness. And finally, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Boaz asad shelo, v'Ruth asad shela, v'Naomi asad shela, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ani asad sheli. Boaz did his part, Ruth did her part, Naomi did her part, and so God says, I too will do my part. To conclude, the book of Ruth models the process for human beings to preserve a just society, even when this may require courage, creativity, and even constructive change. The marriage of Ruth to Boaz and the resulting birth of King David are biblical expressions of the highest honor and accolade. They confirm that the ceremonies of Chalitza and Yibum, with its roots in the earlier story of Tamar and Yehuda and the law in Dvarim 25, are indeed vehicles for social justice and tikkun olam. I leave you with that thought, and thank you again for joining the Hadran Siyum on Masechet Yevamot today. Shavua Tov, everybody.
Thank you, Dean Rachel. That was very beautiful, very fascinating connections that I'm sure many of us have never thought of. Thank you very much. I would like to now introduce my husband, Rabbi Seth Farber. We learned today about rabbis who saw the need to deal with unique situations, individual situations, change the system, and that is part of what he does at his work at Etim, founding Etim and Gior Kalacha. So without further introduction, I will let my husband take over.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We just heard a beautiful articulation of some of the material that we've learned over the last 4 months in the Bible. My words this evening will attempt to bring some of it, at least, to bear on its activization or utilization in today's rabbinical courts in Israel. Through my work at Etim, I have the unique opportunity of participating in the development of the halachic process, and it's playing out in Israel in the rabbinical courts. And I want to give you 2 examples this evening of case studies where texts that we've been studying play a role in today's world. So I'm going to begin with the Gemara we studied in Yevamot on Daf Mem Hey Amud Bet. We grew up thinking that anybody who's born from a Jewish mother is Jewish, and in fact, despite the fact that Rabbi Akiva says that an intermarriage leads to mamzerut, we paskin in the Gemara on Daf Mem Hey Amud Bet, ve'ilchata goy ve'eved habal bat Yisrael. The halacha is that with regard to a Gentile or a slave who is with a Jewish woman, havlad kasher bein bepnuya bein be'eshet ish. Right, the offspring is kosher, and I'm going to come back to that word in a moment, whether she was an unmarried or married woman. This is a good example of what we call in Hebrew pisulei chitun, or people who are prohibited from getting married. And the Gemara makes it very, very clear that the child of an intermarriage where the father is not Jewish and the mother is Jewish is completely kosher. In fact, the Tosfot Yontif notes that this is the reason that Masechet Yevamot comes before Masechet Ketubot and not afterwards. Naturally, you might want to say the Ketubot would come first. After all, we should talk about marriages before we talk about getting out of marriages or what happens when a spouse dies. And the Rambam, in fact, says that unlike Yevamot, which happens and you're forced into it, Ketubot is something you would choose. But the Tosfot Yom Tov says, no. Before we get into Ketubot and marriages, we have to know who can't even engage in marriages. And this Gemara makes it very, very clear that the child of a Jewish mother would be Jewish, or would be kosher, I should say. What the Gemara doesn't tend to address, or doesn't address at all, is a question that came up already in the medieval period. Here, I cited it in the name of the Rif, an 11th century scholar from Morocco. When the Gemara says that the Vlad is kasher, hani mili Yisrael. The strange, right, the sui generis word, the child is kasher, is somewhat strange. Why not just say the Vlad is okay to marry anybody? By saying the Vlad is kasher, it sounds like he's kasher to marry another Jew, another Israelite. Aval lekehuna, but regarding marrying a kohen, if a non-Jewish man had impregnated a Jewish woman and had a girl, that girl in fact would be prohibited from marrying a kohen. Havlad pagum. Di bartahi, if it's a daughter, asura lekohen. So says the Rif, some of his rabbis say that in fact the child of a Jewish man, a non-Jewish man, and a Jewish woman would be prohibited. A girl would be prohibited to marry a kohen. He continues and he says other rabbis say the opposite. He says, I personally, I'm not 100% sure what to do with this case. Now I want to make it very, very clear. For the last 1,500 years, the situation has almost never, ever come up. I want you to think about for a moment what kind of situation would have to happen for a non-Jewish man to have to impregnate a Jewish woman, have a daughter, and that daughter to come to marry a Kohen. The classic case, which again appears in some of the responsa literature, is you have a shtetl, or the equivalent of a shtetl, and a woman shows up with her daughter, right in tow. They move into the shtetl, they grow up, they marry off the daughter to a Kohen, and then the mother acknowledges at some point, after the marriage takes place, the mother acknowledges, hey, I didn't really tell you, but I was raped by the local nobleman, and I didn't want to tell anybody, and this is my daughter, who's the daughter of the local nobleman. What's remarkable, or even dramatic, about what's going on today in Israel is that statistically speaking, I should say, let me begin with that. Statistically speaking, this situation is going to obtain about 150 times this year. For the first time in Jewish history, starting only about 30 years ago, we have hundreds and hundreds of kids, daughters, who are children of intermarriages, whose fathers are not Jewish and mothers are Jewish, who are coming to get married in an Orthodox way, who are coming to get married to Kohanim. And the reason we have that is because of the blessed aliyah of, almost 1 million or more than 1 million immigrants in the former Soviet Union, many, 70% of whom were intermarried. Many of them have daughters. Those daughters would be prohibited to Kohanim. But almost no one knows this situation. And because of that, I get calls. I continue to get calls. But starting about 15 years ago, I started getting calls in my office. The first time I got a call was from the head of the Reform movement, who called and said there was a couple who was his name was Mordechai Cohen. Her name, I don't want to use her real name, but she was an immigrant from the former Soviet Union. And they went into the rabbinate in Rehovot. They were sure that everything was okay. They asked him to prove he's Jewish. He said, no problem. My parents got married here in Israel. They asked her to prove she was Jewish. She brought out all the paperwork for her mom. They said, what about your dad? She said, oh, my dad's not Jewish, but I'm Jewish, no problem. And they wrote in the Psak Din from the Beit Din, they wrote she can marry anybody lebar mi kohen, which means except for a kohen. She thought that was a typo, and she thought it was supposed to say im rav mechayin, with the rabbi who could perform the wedding, which is like the same letters, but just a little out of the way, a little switched around. They walked in. She said, this is my fiance, Mordechai Cohen. They said, but it says here you can't marry a Cohen. She said, what are you talking about? They said, well, you can't marry a Cohen. Your father's not Jewish. Because in fact, that is the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch and Even HaEzer, the source that's in front of you, if a non-Jew marries or impregnates a Jewish woman, then havlad kasher, but we add what doesn't appear in the Talmud, upagum lakuna. Now, there's a debate that it ensued already in the 16th and 17th century. What happens if not lechatchila, but b'diavad? What happens if not beforehand, but afterhand, post facto, we discover that the girl is not, her father is not Jewish. And in fact, the Achronim say, the Sefer Meirot Einayim on the Shulchan Aruch says, well, b'diavad already, we since the Rif already had a debate, he wasn't sure about this, so b'diavad we're willing to say, let them stay married. That was the standard thing 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago. A big debate has ensued in the last 30 or 40 years, and it's a debate that I've been involved in. By the way, in North America, I should say that Rabbi Bleich takes a very, very different position than the Israeli rabbinical courts and the position that I want to present here. But the question is, what does b'diavad mean today? What does post facto mean today? And I'm going to bring you a case. Mordechai, and in this case, Anastasia, right, ended up in the rabbinical courts in Tel Aviv with Rabbi Ben Shimon. And if you just go down a little, and Rabbi Ben Shimon, in his Psak Din, quotes a remarkable passage of Yoshua Ehrenberg, who was another rabbinical court judge in the Israeli rabbinical courts. He writes, he says, I think there's reason in absolute need to allow this couple to be married. It seems to me that there should be good reason to allow Mordechai Cohen and Anastasia to get married, even though Anastasia's father is not Jewish. And then he uses some very, very, very strong language. He says, Kevan shekvar hitkashra im Kohen be'avotot ahava. That means she's already connected with the Kohen with the bonds of love. What that means, and I don't mean this cynically, what I mean it, this is a halachic statement of the first order. He says basically, since they're living together, that is a reason to allow them to continue proceeding to get married. Hitarsaimo, they're engaged. It's rare, if ever, that what we call engagement, right, when the guy gave the girl a ring, but it has no halachic status, all of a sudden that takes on halachic significance. Ukvar omdot lenisuin, and then he says something remarkable. Yesh bazeh mishum aguna. if we weren't allowed them, if we were to prevent them from getting married, this isn't after they were married, this is before they were married. They come to the rabbinical court. In this case, I was representing them. And he says it would be an aguna situation, because what does an aguna mean? An aguna means, again, without taking a moral position on this, an aguna means a woman who's unable to get married. Says Rabbi Ehrenberg, if we were to prevent this couple from getting married, who's to say they'd meet someone else? And therefore, if we don't allow them to get married, if we don't rely on the minority position, then in fact, she actually might end up becoming an aguna. The shayach mishum aguna afilu b'chi agavna, the matzia leminsev la'achrina, the shema lo timtza mishi yisaena. She might not ever find anybody to get married. And therefore, Rabbi Ben Shimon in Tel Aviv, and he in fact told me, he said to me, Shaul, he said, call me by my Hebrew name. He said, when you get cases like this, bring them to me. I know how to resolve these cases. You have hundreds of couples. Again, I've seen literally almost 1,000 couples probably who have had this situation where the father is not Jewish, the mother is Jewish. They fall in love with a Kohen. And Rabbi Ben Shimon said, I take this on my shoulders. I'm going to interpret B'diavad in a very, very wide way. And because of that, I'm going to enable them to get married. I'm going to allow them to proceed. It's not after they got married, where they're on their way to the chuppah, they're registering to get married. I'm going to allow them to do it. So that's a good example of where you have kind of a debate in the Gemara in Masechet Yevamot. And in today's world, we're able to apply that din, apply that law, and find solutions as well. I want to talk about one more area as well, very, very quickly. The first time that this phrase appears in the Gemara, in all of Shas, is in Masechet Yevamot. We just learned it a couple of weeks ago. The story in Narsh about the child, the minor girl who was married by her father, and then someone else stole her from the chariot in which she was on her way to her wedding. And eventually the rabbis come to the conclusion that Afkinu l'Rabbanan l'Kiddushim mineh. Hu asa shelo kahogen, right? That second guy came and took the girl inappropriately. Asu lo shelo kahogen. We treated him in a way that maybe wasn't befitting him, but we treated him in a way that he deserved, so to speak. He deserved it. Fafkinu Rabbanan l'Kiddushim mineh. The sages abrogated his betrothal. They basically undid his betrothal. Now, this has been used and attempted to be used in all sorts of ways. We mentioned a couple of minutes ago the issue of aguna. Some rabbis have tried to discuss the fact that if a man refuses to give a woman a get, we should employ Afkinu Rabbanan l'Kiddushim mineh. That's somewhat controversial still today in the halachic discourse. But when we want to try to undo a marriage, particularly when it comes to mamzerut, when it comes to women who were married to one man and became pregnant by another man, we do engage in a form of what might be considered afkinu. It's not exactly the same mechanism as afkinu, but it is still the same principle of hu asa shelo kahogen and achnu laseh bo shelo kahogen. And I want to give you one example of it. A number of years ago, I got a call from a young man who was a pretty senior officer in the army, in the IDF, who told me the following story. He walked into the rabbinate with his bride, and as you know, in this country, in Israel, there's no civil marriage. They're not an Orthodox couple, but they're going to get married in the rabbinate. And when they walked in, they said, okay, your paperwork looks good. They said, and your paperwork? They said to the man, you have a problem. You're actually a mamzer. He said, what are you talking about? They said, no, you're a mamzer. You have to go to the rabbinical courts. And then he called me and he said, I don't understand. I'm a pretty senior officer in the army. Don't you think that I've done a thing or two for this country? Don't you think they'd want to help me out? Instead, why are they sending me down some path? I don't know where it's going. What was his story? His mom came from North America, from Canada, in the 70s, came to Israel, and she fell in love. She didn't really know anybody here in the early 70s. There weren't a lot of North Americans here. She fell in love with a fellow whose family had made Aliyah from Morocco. The marriage didn't go well, and after a couple of months, it was very clear that the marriage wasn't going anywhere. At the time, she had gotten married. Her family had a couple of friends who were rabbis who had made Aliyah in the late 60s, and they were the witnesses of the wedding. They were basically the only people except for her parents that she knew at the wedding. And she basically walked away from the wedding. She asked her husband for a get. She knew that was important. The husband said, I'm not giving you a get. And she just went back to, she went back to Europe. Her family went back to Canada. And, his family went back to Canada, And he grew up in Europe. He came on Aliyah by himself. His family had a strong connection here. And when he got to Israel, he joined the army. And again, he worked his way up in the army. What happened? The mom, as I mentioned before, had left Israel. She didn't tell anybody in Europe that she had been married before. She met a guy who was not Orthodox. They just got married in a traditional Jewish ceremony, not an Orthodox ceremony. She never told anybody that she was married while she was married to the second guy. And she had brought this young soldier into the world, this young fellow who grew up join the army, etc. And the question then became, hey, what do we do with this fellow? Like, how can we help him? After all, the two witnesses were both Orthodox rabbis. This was a case that I brought to the rabbinical courts in Israel. And again, the rabbinical courts in Israel won't willy-nilly start engaging in Afkinu Rabbanan L'Kiddushin. They're not going to go and abrogate the first marriage, even though the first husband was treated her inappropriately, and really treated her inappropriately, and it was documented. But at the time, if I make a long story short, we ended up going to Rav Ovadia Yosef. Rav Ovadia Yosef, in a very remarkable, I would say even groundbreaking response, which I have, was basically written to me, and this is a copy of the tshuva, not as it appears in his books, but as it was written to me, went through what I would call halachic gymnastics to basically try to abrogate the first marriage, or to basically deny it. Instead of saying, we're going to take apart the first marriage, he wanted to argue that the witnesses were not kosher witnesses. The way he did this was by questioning what else the original witnesses did besides being rabbis. And it turned out one of them, making Aliyah in the 60s, had gone on to a legal career here in Israel. And here's Rav Ovadia Yosef's tshuva that, again, was issued in the rabbinical courts in Israel and ultimately carried the day and enabled this couple to get married. This was the mom who got married in the 70s, in the early 70s. After some time, she got divorced without a get. Right, the mom went back to Europe. She had a son. Before she got the get. The son grew up. He doesn't say that he was a soldier. This rabbi, this Orthodox rabbi, doesn't say he's a rabbi, but he's an Orthodox man, but he became a litigator in the Israeli secular court system. And then Rav Ovadia Yosef goes on a rampage against lawyers. Anybody who uses the secular courts, and again, I hope there's no lawyers on the call, I'm sure there are, but he says anybody who does is an evil person. And it's like he cursed God, and he picked up his hand against the Torah of Moshe. And he says anybody who says that you can do it because of Dina de Malchut Adina, because the law of the land is the law of the land, is wrong. And he's a robber, and he's an evil person. Essentially, if you're a lawyer, says Rav Ovadia, in this tshuva, essentially, you're not kasher for edut. Rav Ovadia even goes on to say, and he actually publicized this later on, in the days right after he wrote this tshuva about this case, he actually says that everybody knows this because rabbis like himself went to the press and said that lawyers are basically, I don't want to say it, because I don't want anybody to get insulted, but lawyers are cheaters and robbers, etc., and therefore they're not able to provide witnesses. Now, right, this is not, again, what I want to try to show you in this case, which again is remarkable. You'd ask me, and I'll just make one quick comment about it. If you were married and your witnesses were lawyers, do not worry, you're still married. Rav Ovadia wrote this regarding one specific case. Again, he makes a general comment about lawyers, but what I want to try to show you is that when someone acted shelo kahogen, that line, when someone acted inappropriately, Rav Ovadia, they treated him inappropriately, and they basically said, it wasn't just you, but we're going to undo your marriage completely. And Rav Ovadia basically, in this instance, took apart the entire first marriage, basically declaring the first couple not married. That made the second marriage a valid marriage. And because of that, the child was, again, legitimate. So we've learned a lot in Masechet Yevamot about mamzerut. The rabbis try very, very, very hard. They're willing even to go to lengths like this to declare someone not, to unmamzer, if you will, someone who was declared a mamzer by the rabbinical courts. Again, what are the implications for this? I leave it to you to think about it. We can talk about it at some sort of different time. But these are remarkable, remarkable applications of some of the principles that we've studied in Masechet Yevamot. For those of you who struggled in Masechet Yevamot or found it somewhat obtuse, again, you just heard a beautiful exposition by Dean Rachel Friedman about one dimension of Yibum and Chalitza. But the halachot, the specific halachot, they're still applicable today. But we do our best to use the principles that are there. The principles are principles of justice, principles of righteousness, principles of family, and most important, principle of bringing God's word into the world. So with that sense of application, I give you back to Rabbanit Michelle, but I hope that these few words have provided some inspiration about how this material can actually be applied in today's world in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Great having my husband and Chavruta with us tonight. I now have the pleasure of, I want to actually, before I introduce our last speaker, two very short things. I want to thank Ahava Liebtag for sponsoring Masechet Yevamot in memory of her grandparents, Leo and Esther Arian. And I also want to mention that also encouraging was if your Hebrew is good in the Hebrew Siyum, we had a woman whose grandmother actually did Yibum. And it was fascinating to hear her talk about how much her grandmother actually ended up loving her second husband, her brother-in-law, and put a very positive spin. So we had a number of positive spins on the Mitzvah of Yibum tonight and all the things we learned in our Masechet. That was also another very interesting positive spin. It's up on our site if that interests you. We now have the pleasure of hearing, as I promised, from a young woman, Elizabeth Kirshner, who learned Masechet Yevamot on the backdrop of preparing for her wedding. And we're going to hear from her reflections on the Masechet.
Great, thank you so much. So ironically, I'm actually, thank God, at a simcha now, at a wedding. And as Rabbanit Michelle mentioned, I am coming up close to, God willing, my own wedding. And it's been a very interesting process studying Masechet Yevamot with that context, because as much as it's not one of the Masechtot that we might think of that's immediately relevant to the marriage process and the halachot that we refer to now, in the way that Kiddushin or Gittin or our new upcoming Masechet Ketubot is, there still was a surprising degree of resonance for me learning this Masechet. And in particular, I really noticed themes of, and I have been hearing these mentioned in a lot of the other words that were said tonight. Notions of continuity, lasting impact, implications and consequences of interpersonal relationships, especially marriage and family. And it feels very fitting to be speaking sort of in this transition, this bridge between Yevamot and Ketubot for this reason. As Ketubot continues and elaborates on these concepts of responsibility and legacy when it comes to family and relationships. So my fiance and I have been meeting with our Meseder Kiddushin to learn all about the Ketubah and the wedding ceremony, and working on personalizing it while balancing integrity to halakha and tradition with making sure it represents us and our values honestly. And if you're not familiar, the Ketubah is distinctly unromantic. And we're in the process of beginning to learn about it now, our next Masechet. It might surprise someone who has never seen it before. It's this peak moment of a couple declaring their love and their devotion, and yet we're so focused on these nitty-gritty legal responsibilities, monetary guarantees, and fine print insurance policies, so to speak. And the system seems to be expressing a sentiment perfectly articulated by Dr. Ayelet Hoffman-Libson in her thorough introduction to Masechet Ketubot. She says, halakha doesn't leave emotions as something free-floating, but wants to concretize the emotional relationship through legal obligations. And this is something that's characteristic of Jewish law as a whole. We've seen in Masechet Yevamot the attempts to account for every worst-case scenario, to leave no stone unturned, reaching for closure upon a person's passing, while also struggling to consider and navigate how the institution of standardized rules affects the individual personal dimension and the inherent variety of human situations and experiences. Through this Masechet, we can sense the recognition that human relationships and emotions are complex and unpredictable. And despite our best intentions, they remain unorderly by their nature. In the face of this, our tradition grapples with protecting people as best we can and preserving people's legacies beyond their lifetimes. Beyond the layers of detail in Masechet Yevamot's many cases, we may observe an effort to establish systems of order in light of life's precarity. This is something that I've been hearing echoed in the Divrei Torah so far. In particular, Rabbanit Michelle was pointing out this idea of trying to end up with a legacy of shalom, of peace. And we really see this, I found this in particular in the anecdote about Nechunya, the well digger's daughter, who falls into a well. And when Chanina ben Dosa is told of this or asked about this, he seems very confident that she'll be okay. He responds the first two times, shalom, she's at peace, specifically the word shalom. And then the third time assures that she has indeed come up from the well. And then he's asked how he might know this. Is it through prophecy? And he says a sort of puzzling phrase. It's not clear how to understand the tone, but he says, something to the effect of, could it be that someone's good deeds would lead to downfall, would be the thing that would be an obstacle for them? And this could be either just very strong faith of it just couldn't be plausible that this injustice would happen. It could also be perhaps, yes, this is how we know things go and it doesn't make sense, and yet this is how it is, which is the case that we sadly see in the next line when we learn that Nechoniah's son died of thirst in a moment of tragic irony. So with this acknowledgement of both the system's attempts at closure for a person's legacy and loved ones, as well as the inevitability of events beyond our control, the Masechet ends with a note of hope and perhaps prayer that Hashem will meet us halfway in these attempts at studying and ruling through the Torah's laws in a way that leaves peace behind as our legacy. We end off with the pasuk that translates roughly as, Torah scholars increase peace in the world, and as it is said, and all your children are learners of God, and much peace are your children. Ken Hiratzon, Yashar Koach to all the Mesayimim Mesemot.
Thank you very much. On that note, I will say the Talmidot Chachamot in this room, all of the people, everybody here who's learned, are part of those Talmidei Chachamim that are bringing peace to the world. So thank you, everybody, for being a part of this. Thank you to the sponsors of this evening. Thank you to Maggie Sandler for making all this happen. And thank you for all our wonderful speakers. And thank you, as I said, to each and every one of you for being part of this, for coming on, for sharing your thoughts, your insights through WhatsApp groups. If you're not part of WhatsApp groups, join them. If your WhatsApp group isn't active, make your group active, communicate with each other. Everything that you learn and take in and what you have to say really means a lot. So share your love, share your thoughts, your insights, and thank you all for coming.
Mazal tov, everyone.
Mazal tov.
Mazal tov.
Mazal tov. L'chaim, l'chaim.
Everyone.
Mazal tov. Mazal tov. Thank you.
Mazal tov.
Thank you.
Mazal tov.